Hey guys, in this video I'm going to show you all the steps I took to make this scene completely from scratch. It was inspired by the bathhouse scene from Spirited Away with these iconic duck looking things. There was a lot of variety to making this, so by watching this video you should learn a lot of things that you can apply to your own diverse projects. I'll try and take it slower, especially with stuff like shaders at the beginning, and we'll build up the pace as we go on. You can also get this file completely for free in the description as well. Let's get into it. Alright guys, so the first thing we're going to do is add a cube, and immediately I'm going to hit Ctrl 1 to subdivide it. And if you go to the modifiers tab, you can see we have the levels viewport feature, which we can increase and decrease to get more or less subdivisions. So I'm going to set it to something like 4 and then apply it. And so now what we have like an egg looking mesh, and what that's going to be is basically going to be the base of our body. So as you can see, what I'm doing here is I'm just kind of manipulating it a bit to try and get it to the shape I want. Obviously it's something you'll have to play around with a lot until you get it to look the shape you like, but yeah. So what I'm doing here is I added a circle, and what I'm doing is I extruded and hit S immediately to scale in the vertices a bit so that we can go towards the center. And what I did also was I hit Alt S with that center loop selected to bring it out a bit, and then just here extruding down again. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get this circle shape in the center that's going to be the pupil of the eye. And so here, as you can see, I'm just manipulating it a lot to get the shape that I want, and I'm going to position it on the body. I'm then going to duplicate the eye and then have another one for the left eye. After that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another circle, and this one is going to be the mouth. So I'm going to rotate it a bit and basically position it where I want the mouth to be. And scaling it out a bit, what we can do is we can then manipulate the vertices so that it basically starts to form a mouth shape. As you can see here, I'm playing around with it a lot, just trying to get it to be good. I'm extruding it back as well and then scaling it so that we can get some sort of thickness for what the interior of the mouth is going to be. And what you want to do here is you just want to extrude it back and make it so that it has this kind of a beak shape. As you can see, I drew it there, the type of shape that I was going for. So yeah, you just want to form a shape like that looks kind of like a beak. Obviously we're going to adjust it a lot later, so you just want to get something down now and we can focus on making it more perfect later on. You can see here I'm raising up the center a bit, and I just keep on making micro adjustments until I get the shape that I like. Over here what I'm doing is I'm selecting the left half of the beak, and basically I deleted all those vertices, and the reason why is because I wanted to then add a mirror modifier so that we can reflect it across the x-axis so that when we work on one side, it'll update on the other side as well. Make sure you enable the clipping feature on the mirror modifiers, and then move the vertices in a bit on the x-axis so that it snaps, and now you basically have a perfectly symmetrical model. You can then hit Ctrl A to apply the mirror modifier, and if you go to the top right, you'll see the symmetry feature, which if you enable it, then what's going to happen is all of the vertices you move will perfectly reflect across the x-axis and it'll be symmetrical. You can then add a subdivision surface modifier to the body, and after that we want to add a displace modifier, and the reason why is because we want the body to be like slightly wobbly so that when it's moving it has a little bit of character to it, if that makes sense. So you can see here with the displace modifier, if you can create a new image texture and change it to clouds. I always use clouds. And yeah, you can also set the coordinates to object and use an empty as the coordinates for the displace modifier texture. So when we move the empty, it's going to move the displacement on our body. And now I'm going to do the same exact thing for the eyes as well, because I want the eyes to have some wobbliness to them. And so yeah, you can just play around with the displace modifier a lot until you get something that you like. You should also add a solidify modifier to both of the eyes, because whenever you have a flat surface that you want to add an outline to later, you should usually add a solidify modifier to it. So as you can see there on both of the eyes, I just added a solidify modifier, and you'll see why later. So now we can get rid of the basic light that's just there by default, and we can add in a sunlight, which is we're going to use as the main lighting for our scene. You can hit new to create a new material and delete the principal BSDF because we don't need it. And what you want to do is add a diffuse BSDF, a shader to RGB, and a color ramp node. What this lets us do is basically take the diffuse light and rasterize it, which means it then becomes something that's no longer based on just physical based rendering, and we can actually manipulate the values of it. This is basically just the way that whenever we're making toon shaders in Blender, this is what we do, is we have a diffuse BSDF, which is just the normal light, and then we use a shader to RGB node and a color ramp after that. If we switch the color ramp colors to be constant instead of linear, we can have it so that it's just two values, and now it looks like it's actually toon shaded. You can also increase the sun strength a bit if you want. I did it here, and you can adjust the colors as well, as you can see I'm doing here. Make the colors whatever you want. I'm keeping it as like a white color with a kind of orange shadow, so yeah. Alright guys, quick little detour. One thing I want to say is make sure you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. What that's going to let us do is if you hit Shift Control Click on any of these nodes, it's going to let you inspect them very easily. So basically if I Shift Control Click on the diffuse BSDF, you can see we just have our basic lighting because that's what the diffuse BSDF is. And if I shift control click on our color ramp, you can see basically it just plugs in the output of this node into the material output so that we could view it. I also added a hue saturation value node just to adjust some of the colors a bit. For the eyes, I'm just using a basic RGB node so that I could just set like a white color for them. And you want to make sure that the one in the shadow is a darker shade of white than the one that's in the light, because obviously if it's in the shadow it'll be a bit darker. We also want to make sure that we give a dark color to the pupil, so if you go into edit mode you can select the faces of where we want the pupil to be, and then in the material slot selection thing you can hit the plus button to add a new material slot, hit assign so that it only assigns it to those faces that we have selected, and then create a new material and just use a black RGB node to set it as the color. Over here I'm just adding a toon shader like we did before for the beak, and I'm setting it to an orange bright color and an orange dark color so that we have toon shading there. Now what I'm doing over here is adding a black outline, and what it's called, technically it's called a solidify outline, and there's a specific process for doing this. Basically what you have to do is when you add the solidify modifier, you have to set offset to 1, turn off fill, turn on flip, and set material offset to -100. After that, you want to add a new material slot and use the arrow thing to make sure that it's at the top of the list. And in that material, you want to just set it to whatever color you want the outline to be. So as you can see here, I set it to black and I renamed the material to outline. And you want to enable the back face culling feature as well. And after that, you can see here, now we have an outline on our object. So that's basically just how you add a solidify outline. And you can see here, I'm doing it for the eyes as well. Remember, make sure you have a solidify modifier before the solidify outline because this is a flat object. And you can see here, I'm adding it to the beak as well. You might notice that your solidify outline is uneven. So what you can do is you can hit Control A and hit Apply All Transforms if you're having that issue, and it'll fix it. You can also enable the bloom feature in settings, which will allow us to have the bloom. So that's just a nice looking effect. Next, what we want to do is we want to add a circle, and what this is going to be for a wooden bucket. So here what I'm doing is I'm extruding all the vertices up, and I'm extruding in on the bottom, just moving it up a bit, and then hitting the F key to fill. And then I'm also hitting E and then S to scale in on the top, then extruding down again, and then scaling in, and then filling, so that we have this bucket shape. You can hit Control 1 to add a subdivision surface modifier to it if you want, and then what you want to do is hit Control R to add supporting edge loops around basically just like the edges of the model, so that the subdivision surface modifier won't smooth it that much in those areas. As you can see here, I'm adding the supporting edge loops. So yeah, you want to make sure to add those. Also add a couple like just in the center, because we're going to add a sort of striped badge thing later, so just add that there. And also for the bottom, I hit the I key to inset here just to make the geometry a bit nicer, but it really doesn't matter because you're not even going to see the bottom. So yeah, you can scale in the bottom of the bucket if you want it to be more tapered like that. And yeah, so over here I went into rendered view, and as you can see I disabled the subdivision surface modifier temporarily, but I'm going to add it back. I hit shade smooth here, right click shade smooth, and then I re-enabled the subdivision surface modifier. I was just kind of playing around to see how the shading would look. Okay, so we can hit new to create a new material. Once again, we're going to get rid of the principled BSDF and make our toon shader with the diffuse BSDF and the color ramp. So you can see I'm doing that here. You can drag the flags for whatever you like. And over here I set it to kind of like orangish color. I'm probably going to desaturate it later. So for the bucket, what we're going to want to do is draw on it so that we can give it a better texture. But in order to do that, we need to UV unwrap it. So over here what I'm doing is I'm just selecting some edges where we can seam it. You usually want to place your seams in areas that are less likely to be seen by the camera. So as you can see, I'm putting it like at the bottom of the bucket and like around the edges that aren't going to be seen by the camera as much. Once you're done marking your seams, select all the faces and then hit U and then hit unwrap. And what that's going to do is it's going to unwrap our model. If you're unfamiliar with what UV unwrapping does, basically it just lays out all the faces of our model flat so that it can be mapped to some sort of image texture, which in our case will be a drawing. So if I add an image texture here, and I also dragged out a mix node here, but don't worry about that for now. I'll explain what I'm doing here with the mix and the hue saturation a bit later, but basically for the image texture, we can hit new to create a new image texture and color whatever you want. You'll notice it's black right now, and that's because like by default the image texture is just blank. But if we go into texture paint mode up here, when we try to draw, you should see it should update where we're drawing with our brush, but the reason why it's not is because the normals are inverted. So select all the faces and hit Shift N to recalculate the normals. So you guys might not have that problem actually when you're doing this, but I did. So you can just hit Shift N and it'll fix it. So yeah, over here I'm just kind of drawing like where I'm going to want like my cracks or indents in the bucket to be. But yeah, so basically to link up this image texture to the rest of our texture, what we have to do is we have to first understand that in this image texture we're making, it's black and white, right? And so what that basically is it's a mask. And when I dragged out this mix node here, basically what the mix node does is it just mixes between two different things. But this FAC input here is basically you can plug a mask into that. And so if we plug our image texture into the FAC, what it's basically saying is use this image texture as a mask. And for this mix node, basically the darker values in the mask will correspond to the A input, whereas the lighter values in the mask will correspond to the B input. So where we draw in the mask becomes white, which means those areas that we draw in are going to become the B value, whereas the areas that we don't draw in are going to stick to just being the A value. So as you can see here, the reason why this setup over here works is because we have what we had before with just our basic toon shader going into the A, but then we have this brighter or darker version of it that we created with the hue saturation value node going into the B. So wherever we draw, we're going to get that hue saturation value version rather than just the regular thing that we had before. Over here what I'm doing is I duplicated those nodes, and the reason why is because the first image texture over there was just going to be the highlights, but this second group that we're making here is going to be for the cracks. So we have highlights and then we have crack. As you can see, it's the same exact setup, only difference is I set the hue saturation value to be a low value instead of a high value because this is going to be darkening rather than brightening where we draw. So as you can see, I've created a new image texture, and so now we actually can draw, and as you can see, it becomes a dark color. So if we draw on the first image texture we made, it'll be a bright color, but if we draw on this second one, it's going to be a dark color. Okay, so we're going to come back to the bucket texturing later. What I want to do now is, using our camera we have in this scene, I want to position it. So you can basically hit Ctrl-Alt-0 on your keyboard, and what it's going to do is it's going to place the camera wherever you're looking currently. Over here I'm setting the resolution to be 2000 by 2000 so that it becomes a square. So now we have our camera in place. After that, what I'm doing here is I'm adding the water. So I'm going to add a circle and basically just extrude in a lot. I'm hitting ES, 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 and then hitting F finally to fill it. Obviously it doesn't have to look exactly like that, but just get it to look something like that. And what you can do now is you can extrude parts that go off of the edges of the model. And this is going to be like kind of water that's like overflowing from our bucket. So as you can see here, I'm just kind of modeling it out. You want it to be more zigzagsy than just straight. The one on the left here, it's a bit too straight, so I'm going to change it later. But yeah, just make sure you give it some nice character and then we can go from there. As you can see, I didn't really add much to the back because that's not going to be seen by the camera, but yeah. Over here what I did was I added a displace modifier, and the reason why we need it is because we want to be able to displace the water and make it look like it's actually moving. So over here, we're doing the same exact thing that we did with the body and the eyes of the duck. Nothing too complicated there. So I hope you guys can follow. You can check back what we did before if it's a bit confusing. Okay, now it's time to make the shader for the water. So basically we're going to do once again just the basic toon shader thing where we have a diffuse BSDF and a color ramp, and I'm going to set it to be like a blue color obviously and plug that into the output. Now I'm also using a hue saturation value node to just change some of the hue saturation and value a little bit. You don't have to add that if you don't want to, but I just wasn't satisfied with my colors at the time. What you then want to add is a mix shader, and the reason why is we're going to mix it with transparency. So we want this blueness to also be a little transparent. So think of it like we're going to mix it with transparency. So we drag out a mix shader, then we add a transparent BSDF, which is just like a transparent node. It'll set your model to be transparent. And if we go to the options on the right hand side and set the blend mode to alpha blend, you can see now we can easily blend the transparency. Over here I want you to follow me very carefully when I'm adding the next two solidify modifiers, because what we want to do is we want to have an outline for this water, but the thing is when you're adding an outline this way to a transparent object, you have to be very careful. So just copy exactly what I'm doing with the next two solidify modifiers, and just remember that if you're adding an outline to a flat object that has transparency like this is what you have to do. Because even for me, discovering how to do this took a while. So just make sure you're copying the settings that I use here, and you can use this as a reference whenever you're adding an outline in this type of situation. I also changed the colors a bit for the bucket and for the water, just made them a little more like less saturated. Over here what I did was I duplicated the bucket and I moved it down a bit because we're gonna have like a second bucket that gets filled with even more water. Over here I'm adding a circle again and just doing the extrude thing and then filling. And the shader for this bottom water is going to be a little bit more. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a gradient texture. Hit Ctrl-T to give yourself mapping coordinates, and what you'll see that does is it gives us a gradient from left to right, and we can add a color ramp after that to clamp the values, set it to constant, and as you can see it just becomes two values now. We want to switch it from linear to quadratic sphere though. Quadratic sphere gives us a sphere gradient rather than a left to right one, and you want to move that sphere around so that it's basically in the center. You can move it around using the mapping coordinates. So as you can see, I'm just playing around with it here, just trying to get it into place a bit. The next thing we're going to do is something I talked about a bit in my stylized animated water, water video, but basically if we add a mix node in between the mapping and the quadratic sphere, we can basically displace this gradient if we add a noise texture and then plug it into the B value. So this is just like a common tactic that's used, so it's just important to know and it's pretty useful. I like to set it to divide usually and then just increase the fact until I get something that I like. So as you can see here, I'm playing around with it. Alright guys, there's 4th of July fireworks in the background, so sorry if you can hear them. So you can set the colors of this gradient to be brighter on the outside and darker on the inside. Make it a blue color obviously because it's going to be water. After that we can drag out a mix node, and what we can do is we can add a noise texture, and the reason I'm adding this is because I want to fake kind of like a distortion in the water, if that makes sense. You'll see once it's done. But I'm adding a color ramp here once again so that we can binarize the values, so there's just like 2 things and it's tune shaded. You can hit Control T on the noise texture to get the mapping nodes, and you can change the mapping around if that's what you want to do. Plug it into the FAC, and as I told you guys before when I was explaining the bucket texturing, the FAC just inputs a mask, so we're using this noise texture as the mask, which means the A will correspond to the dark areas of the mask, which means whatever is inputted in A will be in the dark areas of the mask, and whatever is inputted in B will be the light areas of the mask. After that, I just added a hue saturation value node to just play around with the values a bit. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but yeah. I then added a multiply node, and the reason why is what we're going to do here is we're going to add our diffuse BSDF, our shaders RGB, and our color ramp node again, so that we can actually get the lighting. As you can see, if you shift control click on the color ramp, there you can see we just have the sun lighting, and if we input that to the B value of our multiply node, you can see now it's multiplying what we had before with this tune shaded lighting node setup that we made over there. And yeah, now as you can see, when I move the sun around, it updates. Wait, after that, what we need to do is we need to make some ripples, so we can add a Voronoi texture, set it to the settings that I'm doing here. You want to use a rings and set the value to be Z. You can hit Control T after that, and what that'll let us do is map around the coordinates. Over here I switched it from generated to object coordinates, and the reason why is because when you switch it to object, what it does is it'll center the texture at whatever the origin point of the model is. You can see the origin point is just this orange dot here that we have when we have an object selected. So when you use object coordinates, what it'll do is it'll center that. It'll center the texture around there. Over here what I'm doing now is I'm adding another gradient texture, and it's going to be a sphere once again. What we want to do is we just want to basically constrict these ripples so that they're only in the center of our water. So here I'm switching it to quadratic sphere as we have before, and I'm using a multiply node to multiply the two together, so that as you can see here, when we multiply the two, the ripples now only exist where that sphere is, and it's just occluded from everywhere else because the two are being multiplied together. And yeah, you can use a map range node as well to clamp individual things. Like I added it after the wave texture, and what that does is it just clamps the wave texture itself. If a lot of this sounds kind of nebulous to you guys, I recommend just playing around with it. Like copy that part of the node setup that I have here and then just play around with it and you'll see what it's doing. After that, we can add a color ramp node and switch it to constant so that we can actually tune shade those ripples. I added a multiply node after as well. The reason why is I just wanted to increase the brightness of the texture before getting tune shaded, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. I also switched the gradient texture back to spherical from quadratic sphere because I thought spherical just looked a bit nicer. Basically they're the same thing, but spherical is just like less smooth. Over here I realized things were off kilter a bit, so I was just moving the bucket so that I wanted to make sure that it's on top of the ripples. Finally, what we want to do is we want to add a mix node, and what we're going to do is use the ripples as the FAC in the mix node and set the B value to be white so that now you can see those white ripples. Finally, I wanted to add some transparency, so I'm doing the mix shader and transparent thing once again that we did before. And yeah, remember to set the blend mode to alpha blend. Okay, after that, what we want to do is we want to add what's called the reflection plane, or at least that's what I coined the term to be. So if you duplicate one of our water planes, you can get rid of the material on it, and we're going to add a new one. Basically, just add a glossy BSDF node and set the roughness to be a low value, and then place that plane below our transparent water, and now you have a nice reflection. Make sure you have screen space refractions enabled in settings, otherwise this won't work. So yeah, you could do that. I duplicated the plane and I added it to the bottom of our smaller bucket water as well, and yeah, so I'm just renaming them to reflection plane, and so I highly recommend you add those. After that, what we want to do is we want to change the background color. What we can do is, it's very easy. We just want to add a light path node, and we're going to add a mix shader, and we want to have an RGB node going into the second slot and have the is camera ray output to go into the FAC. Now what this does is, I mean, it lets us change the background color obviously, but the reason why we need this convoluted node setup is because by default, changing the background color will adjust the shading on our models as well, because the shading is also based on what the background looks like. But what this setup does is it basically tells Blender to isolate our shading of the objects from the background color so that we can have them completely separate. Basically the is camera ray mask, basically all it is it just separates the objects where the objects are black values and the background is white values, which is why in the second slot where we have our RGB node, we can just easily change the background color to whatever we want without affecting the shading. Now what we're going to do is we're going to make the water wheel. So what you want to do is you want to add a circle and just delete half of the top and like all of the bottom. Because what we're going to do is we're going to reflect it so that we only have to do work in one quadrant of our wheel. So as you can see here, I'm adding mirror modifiers so that we can easily reflect it. If you hit Shift S and then hit cursor to selected, what that'll let you do is it'll let you put your 3D cursor in the center. And if we use the 3D cursor as our pivot point, we can hit ES and then scale in so that now we have some thickness. I also extruded all the faces backwards. And what you can do is you can add a loop cut and then extrude the inner part backwards a bit more. Extrude again and then hit E and then Alt S on those final parts there. Sorry if it's a bit convoluted, but you just want to get it to look like this basically. What you can do then is you can add a loop cuts to random parts of the model and just extrude parts out basically that are going to be the, I guess you could say, shelves of the water wheel. As you can see here, I'm adding those shelves. You just want to extrude them up and then rotate the top of it. But yeah, nothing too complicated. Over here, what I'm doing now is I'm adding a cylinder and just basically flattening it into a circle. And I want it to be at the center of our wheel. Now what I'm doing is I'm adding a plane and basically just mirroring that plane around because we want this plane to be the, if you ever looked at a water wheel, it has like those planes that are just kind of like on it, I guess. I don't know what the technical term is, sorry. But yeah, you just want to place them just like that so it looks like a wheel. I'm going to duplicate that circle to the back of it and then duplicate everything as well so that it goes back there. Okay, now so in rendered view, what we can do is add the same toon shader setup that we've been doing all the time. And over here, as you can see, I'm just selecting all of the objects and hitting Control L link materials so they all have the same shader. I set it to be a beige type of wooden color, so yeah. Now what I'm doing is I'm adding a solidify outline to all of the objects here. Okay, quick little detour guys, I just want to say if you hit Alt D and duplicate an object instead of using Shift D, what it'll do is it'll basically copy the object data as well, meaning when we move the vertices on one, it'll move it on the other as well, because they're now sharing object data. And if you want to get rid of this, there's two ways to do it. One way, if you hit Control A and you hit Apply All Transforms, it'll ask you create new object data users and apply transformation. So if you click that, now you can see it's separate from the other cube. The other way is if you go to this vertex tab down here, you can hit this 2 button, which will make it its own. And you'll hear me later in this video using that terminology, so just adding this here to tell you. You're going to have to hit that button that comes up. You need to hit it in order to apply transforms on a model that was duplicated with Alt D because it's sharing data with another object. So you have to make it its own single user by just clicking that button. So just keep adding the outlines here and you'll be done soon. Over here what you can do is you can add an empty and basically just select all of the objects in the wheel, shift click on the empty and then hit Control P to parent it to the object, and I use the object keep transform option. And so yeah, now all of those wheel objects will just follow that empty when you move it around. After that, what we're going to do is we're going to add the kind of like wooden window thing in the background. So I just added a cube here. It's very simple modeling, literally just like, I mean, you probably don't even need me to show you this. You can probably honestly make your own like more interesting looking window here if you want to. I was just doing it because it's not really like that big of a thing in our final product of the animation here. You can see I'm adding beams that go like top and like to the sides as well so that it looks like a proper window. Kind of looks more like a prison cell right now, but I'll fix that up a bit. So we can add the shader for it. Really simple, literally just a basic toon shader that we're going to have as a brown color. And yeah, nothing to explain there at this point of the video since we already talked about how to make simple shaders like this a lot. Over here I added a solidify outline to the window in the back, and yeah, we're not going to focus that much on texturing them because they're not the focal point of our scene, so we don't really need to give them like as much love. Over here I also duplicated the sides of the window like to the left and to the right. I probably should have just extruded, that would have been better, but that's what I did. Over here I added a plane, and what this is, it's basically the back wall of whatever this like location is, I guess. As you can see here, I'm just scaling it out a bit, and I'm adding in some loop cuts to basically just remove it from the place where our window is so that it looks like it's actually a window and we can see outside of it. For the shader for this, really simple, just a basic toon shader once again, but we're going to add a bit more to it actually. So basically what we want to do is we want to have these cracks, or I don't know if you'd even call them cracks, there's like indentations on the wall. We can add a wave texture which is going to allow us to have these stripes, and basically using a color ramp node we can toon shade it as we always do, and then plug that into the FAC or the mask feature, whatever you want to call it, and we'll use the B value here so that in the black parts we can change the color. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the hue saturation value trick once again, and so we can use a low value for the hue saturation value node so that we get these dark cracks. And now we're going to do the same exact thing, but this time, like we did with the bucket, we're going to have a bright one. So as you can see here, if we add the mapping coordinates to the second wave texture here, we can move them around a bit. And if we offset it just slightly from the dark cracks, you can see it kind of forms like this sort of beveled effect, or like as if it's catching light. So you see here, if we increase the value with the hue saturation value node, we basically have a background that looks like it's indented when it's actually not in reality. So it's pretty cool. It's a really nice way to fake an effect like that on a background. After that, we can drag out a mix node, and we're going to add a Voronoi texture. This time we're going to use it for the sake of adding some scratch marks to the wall. If we hit Ctrl T to add the mapping coordinates, you can increase the scale in X by a lot, and so it looks very vertical. And once again, plugging the color ramp into the FAC and then using the hue saturation value node, we can decrease it, which results in us having this wooden pattern. And I'm going to switch it to constant here, and honestly it looked pretty good when we kept it as linear before, but I like to just have it toon shade for the style that we're going for here. So I switched to constant on the color ramp. Okay, now what we're doing is we're basically going to be making some of the leaves. So first we're going to make a heart-shaped leaf. If you just look what I'm doing here, it's very simple. We're just kind of like adding a plane and then using loop cuts and then just editing it a bit. And I added a subdivision surface modifier. As for the shader, very simple. We're just going to add like a green RGB node to it. We're also going to add a hue saturation value node, and what we want to do is add an object info node and put this random input into a color ramp and then put that into the value. As you can see, what it does is if we duplicate it around, it now assigns a random value to each of our objects when we duplicate it around. The reason why is because the random output basically gives us a random value for each object that has this shader, and so we're just plugging in that random value to the value input in the hue saturation value node. So you can think of it like it's darkening and brightening these objects randomly, just based on like a random seed kind of thing. And this color ramp here that we added, it's not doing anything right now, but basically what it's saying is we want the random value to be from 0 to 1. So if we increase the black value to something like 0.7, now that random value is only going to be from 0.7 to 1, so it's not going to be so dark when we duplicate it around. Okay, after that you can start duplicating your leaf around, obviously, and what I want to do is I want to add a curve, and we're going to make like a kind of stylized branch thing that like goes around. It's kind of like a decoration almost, but it's just going to be like this branch thing that goes around our water and our scene pretty much, just to give it some more, I guess, like foliage type of look. So we need to add this branch. Obviously I'm just doing a basic toon shader here with a brown color, and you can see I kind of had it looping around because I thought that looked nice. Duplicated it and then reflected it over the x-axis, and yeah, if you ever want, you can duplicate part of a curve and then hit P and then by selection to separate it as a new object. So that's how I'm making a lot of new curves here, is I'll just like duplicate it and then separate it as its own object. And so yeah, as you can see here, nothing too complicated. You just want to make a shape that you enjoy. If you plan on rotating your camera a lot more, you're going to want to make sure that it looks good from multiple angles. And yeah, over here I added a sphere, and this is just like another kind of foliage item. We're just going to have another basic toon shader, and it's going to be a green color, and so I'm just going to duplicate that around. So over here what I'm doing now is I'm going to add like a normal leaf model. So here I just added a plane, I'm extruding it a bit, and you want to be looking at like references of leaves and stuff. That's going to tell you like what the shape is supposed to look like. So yeah, it's a very simple modeling job, just extruding and loop cutting and moving stuff, and that's about it. If you use proportional editing, you can kind of like grab the centerpiece and just drag it up a lot to give it a curve, which is a nice thing to do. You can also add a subdivision surface modifier and a solidify outline. Once again, remember it's a flat object, so we have to add like a second solidify at first before we add the solidify outline to it. Over here for the shader for this leaf, I'm doing the same exact thing that we did for the other leaves, just having the random node and basically just randomizing it. Now we want to draw the leaf fins, so if you just unwrap by selecting all the faces and then hitting the U key and then hitting unwrap, you can easily unwrap a model like this because it's already flat, so we don't need to place any seams. After that, all we have to do is add a mix node and an image texture node, and obviously plug it into the FAC, make a new image texture, and then from there, like we've been doing on a lot of our other objects, we can just draw, and using that hue saturation value node setup, we can have it darken on wherever we draw. Over here what I'm doing is I'm just duplicating around some branches a bit more and setting them into place. So yeah, just make sure you give it a good variety, have some that are hanging off the edges more, some that are hanging off less. Over here, one of the curves I added, I put it as like a dark green color. You can think of it kind of like a vine that I was making. Over here, I made like another leaf object that's specifically for the vine, and you can see I'm duplicating it around here on this vine object that I made. And yeah, I just thought it looked good. It helped break up the monotony of having like all these like brown wood curves going everywhere, and now we have this like vine thing that's kind of green a bit. So you always want to be thinking about like having contrast and stuff like that as well. Make sure you're not just using like one thing over and over again. So over here, what I'm doing is I'm adding the belt to the bucket. I don't even know if that's what it's called, but I'm gonna call it that. Basically, you want to alt click to select that edge loop going around the bucket. Hit Shift D, hit Alt S to just kind of like scale it out a bit, and then hit P by selection so that you can separate it as its own object. Now what you want to do is you want to add a solidify modifier to give it some thickness, and then add another solidify modifier to act as the solidify outline. As for the material for it, we're just going to use a simple brown color, nothing too crazy at all. And you also want to duplicate the belt down so that now we have two of them instead of just one. So as you can see now, our bucket looks a lot better. Also, if you go to the right hand side of the screen, you can find this shadows feature, and you can change the cascade size to be something like 2048, which is basically going to just make our shadows more high quality, and it'll fix this kind of like artifact thing that existed before. Over here, I was also adding our solidify outline to our buckets because I had forgotten to do that before. One other thing is you'll have this option where you can check use curves, and what that'll let you do is it'll let you add a lot of contrast to your scene. Okay, now for our duck object, we have to work on it a lot more. So as you can see, the beak was kind of looking awkward, so I just started adjusting it a lot more. One important thing we've yet to make is the mouth. So what you should do is you should Shift D the beak, scale it down, and you can temporarily just disable all the modifiers on it so that you can see the vertices a lot easier. And what you want to do is you want to kind of fill the back of it. So as you can see here, I'm filling the faces in the back by just like selecting some of the vertices on the top and some on the bottom, then hitting F. And then you can hit F multiple times to fill a row of faces using the F2 add-on. It's free and comes with Blender, so you can just enable that. Or you don't have to use it if you don't want to, just fill them manually. But yeah, you want to fill these vertices in the back is what you want to do so that our mesh becomes sealed off. And that's important because when the beak opens, we want the back of the mouth to be sealed off in like a red color. So what we want to do now is we want to unwrap the beak. So over here, I'm just selecting the loop at the front, hitting mark seam, and then cutting around to the back, and that'll give us a pretty nice unwrap. You're probably going to have to hit Shift N to recalculate the normals though, so make sure you do that in case you're having any texture painting problems. And the reason why we're unwrapping the beak is because we want to draw on it, so we need to unwrap it. So over here I'm doing our basic image texture setup that we always do with the mix node. And yeah, we've done this a bunch of times by now, so I'm sure you can understand what I'm doing here. And I'm just going to draw in some sort of nostrils. For the shader of the mouth object that we duplicated in the back, setting it to be like a red color obviously. I actually didn't even use any shading on the color ramp, I just kept it all as one red color. And I think that looks a lot nicer. Anyways, after that, I just adjusted the beak shape a bit more to make it look a bit less awkward. So yeah, as you can see here, I refined the shape of the beak a lot. And once again, you can download this file if you want to see exactly what it looked like for me in the end. I also changed around the colors on the body a little bit. I wanted the bright value to be like a lot brighter. So now it's like bright to the point where it's casting this bloom effect because I set the value of it to be so high. You don't have to do that though. Honestly, it might have looked better if I didn't do that, but I don't know. You can also adjust the threshold setting in the bloom settings, and that'll let you adjust how strong the bloom is. Okay, after that, what we want to do is we want to make the rig for our duck character thing. So if we add an armature, what you can do is go into edit mode and extrude a few bones with the E key. After that, you want to move the armature so that it's in place with the body. And what you can do is, this is very simple, we're just going to select all the objects, including the eyes, the beak, the mouth, and then we want to shift click on our armature and hit Control P with automatic weights. So as you can see now, if we hit Control Tab to go into pose mode, when we move around these bones, you can see they update on our mesh. One thing you may notice though is like the top bone is deforming the mouth and the beak. You might not want that, so if that's the case, if you go into the vertex groups tab of any of these meshes, you'll see now that there are these bone groups which correspond to the names of the bones in our armature. So the top bone was called bone.003, so if you select all the faces and hit remove from bone.003, now that bone.003 is not going to affect that mouth anymore, as you can see. But I actually personally liked the way Blender had it as default when it did affect the mouth, so I'm just gonna undo that and keep it that way. Okay, after that we can duplicate our duck and put it into the water. So I just selected all the objects and duplicated all of them and moved them into the water. As you can see, I duplicated the duck again, and yeah, you're basically just duplicating them around at this point and making slight adjustments to their shape or whatever you want. If you want to give some of them a different color or like different characteristics, you can do that too, but I kind of kept things the same for this, more or less. Obviously, try and adjust like where they're looking so that they're not all looking straight, because that would be boring. Over here, I was just adjusting the size of the eyes a bit because they were a bit too small for my liking. Over here, what we want to do now is we want to model a sort of towel that's going to be on top of the head of some of these ducks. So if we add a cube, we can very easily make this like book looking or like bookcase looking thing by just adding some loop cuts and extrusions and all that. And what we can do with this blocky shape is we can add a subdivision surface modifier, add some supporting loops around the edges so that it isn't so smoothed out, and we can add a displace modifier. And like we've done a lot of times before, you can just set the image texture to clouds and yeah, adjust the strength as you like. I also made it curved a bit, so it's going to take the shape of the top of the head of the duck a bit. And yeah, you can kind of just like mess around with the vertices on this towel object, and once we go back into object mode with the modifiers applied, it's going to look more like a towel. Over here for the shader, very simple, we're just using the basic toon shader setup, and yeah, over here I'm adding a solidify outline so that we can get a nice outline for it, and yeah, after that you can move it and place it on top of the head of some of your ducks. So you could see me doing that here. I also duplicated it down to the one on the bottom too. So now what we want to do is we want to finish texturing the bucket. So I already showed you before how we can texture paint on it. We already made all of our image textures, so you can just draw on them. I made them a bit too big, to be honest. I should have made them a lot smaller. They also look a bit wobbly here. Obviously I could have gone in and fixed that, but I didn't see it as too necessary considering a lot of the wobbliness was off camera. And yeah, after that you can add your highlights by just drawing those in with the bucket highlights image texture that you made. After that, what we want to do is we want to draw in some more variation to the cracks. As you can see here, I just drew in some more like indentation, I guess you could call it, and over here I'm kind of like knocking back the opacity on some of the cracks by setting my brush to a black color and just drawing with a low strength. Over here I'm further adding some more indentation. And yeah, you just want to get it to look kind of imperfect because reality is imperfect and there's always a lot of like variation to it. If I spent more time on texturing the bucket here, I definitely could have gotten it to look a bit better. But yeah, not much else to say. Just have your highlight in places where they would naturally appear so that it looks like it's catching some light. After that, what we can do is in our shader, we can add a Voronoi texture, or a noise texture, sorry, and you can add kind of like imperfections like we did on the wall. I've already showed you how to make stuff like this a bunch of times in this video, so I don't think I have to go over it that much, but here's just what I'm doing. I use a noise texture and we just have these kind of specks that are going to appear like that, and of course you can vary the scale on the noise texture if you want to make it bigger or smaller. So I did this twice, one time for like dark scratches and then this time it's going to be for like light scratches. So yeah, that was pretty much it for the texturing of the bucket. Nothing too crazy there, I guess. It'll take you some playing around with to get a position you like. I also adjusted the material for the outline on the water. I set the value of it to be a lot higher because I wanted to be kind of glowing. Before we continue, I just want to say a lot of you guys think the reason you may be unable to make high quality models like this has something to do with your technical skill or shaders or something. The reality is that's not the case. The reason you may not be able to has everything to do with observational skill. Over on ukiyogirls.io, I teach both observation and technical skills in depth so that you can create your own custom awe-inspiring models. I'll show you step by step how to make this character portrait from scratch, as well as a rigged full body character version including texturing the body and everything else. Not only that, but I'll show you the full process for making this koi pond model in animation as well as the sunflower one, all from scratch once again. You'll learn about sculpting the body, texturing, and making custom shaders that give off that wow factor even if you don't have prior experience. As stated before, you'll also learn all about my observational methods, and I like to call them the layered method, and it's basically just a method I use to guarantee that my works come out high quality. The point here is to gear you up to be able to make your own incredible works without having to rely on tutorials or other people's art. I can guarantee you that it's never been easier to improve and master this style, and I mean, I basically reduced it down to a science over the years. Not to mention, you'll also be given access to our Discord community where I can give you direct help with your art needs or any questions you have. So if you want to fast track your learning, check out ukiyogirls.io. Alright, let's get back to the video. So over here what I'm doing is I'm modeling a petal because we're going to have these kind of, not lotus flowers, but they look a bit like it, I guess. So over here I'm just modeling a petal again. Obviously, once again, use like reference images to look at flowers and stuff, and that'll help you get the shape that you're going for. We've done a lot of like leaf modeling in this video, so I don't think there's much to say here, other than just adjust it to your liking. Over here I added a UV sphere to act as the base, and I curved the petal a little bit as well. And after that, I started kind of like duplicating around these petals so that we had a full flower. And you can add a path curve to act as the follicles for the flower. I kind of made it into like a backwards C shape. But yeah, now we're going to skip ahead and just work on the shader for the petals. So once again, just using a basic toon shader setup like we always do. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a gradient texture and basically just play around with it, just rotate it a bit. And what we want is we want it to be going in from the interior of the flower to the exterior, as we have here. And you can switch it to quadratic so that it's a lot more smooth. Basically add a mix node, and what you can do is if you plug in that gradient texture into the mask, then as the V value, we can have like a reddish value so that now, as you can see, we get this like redness in the center of our flower, this dark redness. And that's a thing that I like to do a lot. After that, we can add another mix node. We're going to add a wave texture to add some striations to the flower. So if we switch the texture coordinate from generated to UV, we can have it so that the wave texture actually follows the geometry of our petals. And yes, so you can play around with the wave texture size and all that. I used a map range here instead of a color ramp. They actually kind of like do the same thing, but you could use color ramp there as well. So I recommend you just do that if you're newer to shaders because it's a bit more self-explanatory. And over here I wanted to make those striations dark, so I plugged it into the FAC, and for the hue saturation value I set it to a low value. I also changed the values a bit for our colors for the flower. And for the flower base and for the follicle, I just kept it as a dark red color, and yeah, that's it for that. After that, I duplicated around the follicle a lot more. So as you can see here, this is like that kind of lotus shape that I was talking about. And yeah, you can also add an icosphere and position these like sphere things at the top of the follicles. It's just a common thing that happens in flowers when they have these follicles. Sometimes they have these like spherical looking shapes that come at the end, so I'm just doing that. You can easily snap it by hitting Shift S, cursor to selected on the top point of the curve, and then hitting Shift S, selection to cursor to easily snap the spheres to the top of the curves. After that, I decided it was time to duplicate the flowers around, so you can see me just selecting the flower and then just duplicating it around. I kept it more on like the sides of the camera. For some reason, that was just kind of like the stylistic choice that I made. So yeah, after that, what it was time to do was to add the ripples that go under the ducks. So I added a circle and basically just want to position it around the duck themselves. And if we hit slash to go into local view, we can just work on the shader separately here in a nicer environment. So we can add a wave texture, which as I showed you before, if we switch it to rings in the options and set it to Z, we can get these ripples, and we're going to use object obviously as the coordinates so that it appears at the origin point and we don't have to move it at all. After that, we're going to add a gradient texture again and set it to spherical so that we can multiply out the edges of it so that these ripples are only in the center of our circle. So as you can see there, I'm using the multiply node to multiply them together, and then we have a color ramp after that using constant to make it toon shaded. And then after that, I'm using a mix shader and using transparency so that basically we're using those ripples as a mask, and anywhere it's black, it's going to be transparent. Anywhere it's white, we're going to be able to just set it to whatever color we want. So here I set it to like a bright white color, and so now we have these transparent ripples that we can duplicate around. So here I duplicated it around to the part where the water falls and it meets the lower water base, I guess you could say. What you can do is you can move around the gradient texture on that one so that it's only on like the sides, and that's what we want on these edges here. So you can duplicate that around as well. And so yeah, nothing too crazy there, just a lot of stuff that we've already done before, just applied a bit differently. And yeah, so after that you can keep on making more minute adjustments to your scene, like adding more branches or leaves maybe, or like moving things around. It's really up to you. Over here, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add the lamp. So I decided to make it a bit more blocky, so I added a circle and set the vertice count to only 8. After that, what I did was I extruded in with ES, and at this point you just want to be like kind of looking at pictures of lamps and stuff like that so that you can gain some inspiration. Not really too much I can say here, I'm just modeling as I go and trying to make the shape that I want. So you can see here I'm adding loop cuts because I want there to be like these beams coming out from the bottom. As you can see, I select them here and then extrude them out and scale it a bit. So yeah, then I just filled between the edges on those beams and extruded up a bit more, and now I just wanted to make like a top for the lamp. Obviously, like in between those beams I'm going to have the light itself, and so I need to add like some sort of roof to the lamp now, like I'm doing here. Just extruding up a bit and then scaling in, and yeah, just finishing it off with a head with the top part and just filling in some of these faces here that I forgot to fill earlier. Over here I added another circle, and the point of this was to be like kind of like a base for the lamp, if that makes sense. Over here what I did was I added a cube, and what I'm doing here is I'm kind of making like an ornamental looking decoration that I'm going to have at the bottom of the lamp. You can see here I'm really just like winging it and kind of just modeling whatever, just doing it as I go completely, and yeah. And after I'm done with it, I hit Control 1 to subdivide and add some supporting loops to the sides, and then I just start kind of like duplicating it around this base object that I made. After that, for the material, it was very simple. I literally just did a basic toon shader thing once again. So as you can see, it's kind of like this bronze color, and I added a glossy BSDF and used a shader to RGB and a color ramp here to give it kind of like a specular reflection effect. Over here you can see I'm mixing that mask and setting it to be like an orangish, or not orange, like a beige light color. You don't have to add that, but I just think it looks nice. It's kind of like a reflection thing. As for the top, I actually decided to split off the top and make it its own object, because you'll notice like the bottom part of this top thing was flat and didn't have any thickness to it, so I wanted to separate it and then give it its own solidify modifier. You could add a subdivision surface if you want, but I decided to actually just bevel the edges. So you can see here I'm just beveling. Obviously, if you want to make it smoother, what you can do is you can take those beveled edges and kind of like spread them out so it isn't looking so like octagonal, I guess you could say. But that's up to you. I mean, once again, you're probably making a different lamp than me if you're following this. Maybe you're like inspired by a different type of lamp that you want to make. So I don't even know if you're following me here, but this is just my process and my way of thinking about it. Adding toon shading to like hard surface object like this is a bit complex, so you have to play around with like hitting shade smooth and stuff like that, and like manipulating the geometry, adding loops. After that, I added the solidify outlines obviously, and I didn't have any trouble there, which was nice. So then I scaled it down and I just placed it into the scene, and now it's nice in our view. After that, you can add a sphere and place it like inside the beams that we have, and what this is going to be is it's going to be the light itself. So you can just add an RGB node as the material and set it to like a very bright value, something high, and if you have bloom enabled, what it's going to do is it's going to cast light, or not light, but it's going to have like this glowing effect which kind of simulates light. And if you duplicate that sphere and you separate it as its own material, you can basically mix it with transparency. So now you have like this outer one that is transparent, and then you have the inner one which isn't transparent, and it's kind of like has this nice effect as if it's like spreading. After that, what we can add is some kind of like fountain decoration object we can have at the center. So here I added a circle, and I'm just like kind of extruding up and making kind of this decoration thing that we're going to do. I've already showed a lot of like modeling like this in this video, so I'm just going to cut to when I finished it. So it looked like this when I was done. As you can see, I also added a subdivision modifier and a solidify outline. And as for the shader, pretty simple, just basic toon shader. And I added the glossy BSTF again so that we can do the specular reflection mask thing again. So you can see here using a mix node and then plugging it into the fact and setting the reflection to whatever color we want it to be. We can do it like that. And then after that, I added some scratches using a noise texture and just playing around with that like we've done a million times already in this video. You can see now we have a shape like that, and I just moved it into the center. After that, what we can do is we can add an empty, and what you want to do is for this empty you can name it track, and what we want to do is we want to parent our camera to the track empty so that when we rotate the track empty, it'll rotate the camera as well. And that's how we're going to do our rotate around animation. As you can see here, I'm just keyframing the track empty so that it kind of like rotates a bit on the timeline. And obviously the camera is parented to it, so it follows like that. Now also for the camera, if we insert a keyframe, then go to the graph editor with Control Tab. If you don't know what the graph editor does, by the way, it's basically just representing like the location, rotation, and scale of our object, but with like curves, I guess you could say. So if you move the X location curve up and down, you can see it's increasing and decreasing our camera's X location. So yeah, basically if you select the Z location, you double click it, hit Shift H to hide all of the other curves. If you go to the modifiers tab, what you can do is you can add a noise modifier to this curve, so you can see now the Z location of our camera is kind of like oscillating back and forth because we've added noise to that curve. And you can add noise to the rotation on the X and the Z as well, which is what I like to do usually. And so now there's going to be like this camera shake that happens when our camera rotates. After that, we can animate the wheel as well. Very easy. We just have to rotate that empty that we made, that all of the wheel objects were parented to. And yeah, I recommend hitting T and then selecting linear to switch it to linear interpolation rather than smooth in, smooth out, and hit Shift D linear extrapolation so that that animation continues on forever. And then after that, if you want to adjust the speed, all you have to do is just move around the second keyframe, and like the further away you make it from the first keyframe, the slower the animation will be, and the closer it is, then the faster it will be. After that, you can rig your branches and stuff as well if you want by adding an armature and then just extruding bones so that they fit into the branches and stuff. And you'll have to switch your branch curves by going to the object menu and then hitting convert curve curve to mesh because you can't animate curves like that. You have to convert it to a mesh first. So do that, and then after that you can select your branches and your leaves and then shift click on whatever armature you have associated with it and then hit Control P and then with automatic weights, and it'll automatically skin it together. So if you go into pose mode, you can then move everything. Over here you can see I'm rigging our lamp as well because I want it to be kind of like dangling, I guess you could say. So you can select all the objects for the lamp, then shift select the armature and then hit Control P and with automatic weights. Over here I'm rigging like the decorative branch that I made earlier as well. So I'm just adding some branches around the flowers that we have up top over here. So you can see here I'm just kind of like duplicating them around. I could have varied their shape a bit more here, but I was just kind of speeding through it at the moment and I was planning on refining it a bit later, so that was the goal here. And after that you can add an armature that goes through the branches, and what you can do is you can parent these flowers to the bone itself so that when we move the bones it will move the flower and the branches too. So as you can see here I'm selecting the base of the flower because we have everything parented to that already. Then I'm hitting Control P on the bone and then hitting bone. So I just repeated that process for the rest of the lotus looking flowers that we have, so nothing really much to say there. Alright, so now what we want to do is we want to make it so that we can open and close the beak or mouth of our duck. So if you go to the shape keys tab, what you can do is you can click the plus button. What it's going to do is it's going to give us a thing called basis. That doesn't really do anything. All basis means is just like what the model looks like without any shape keys added. If you hit the plus button again, what you can do is turn the value to 1 on that key 1, and then when you move the vertices on that, what you can do is drag up and down the influence of the key 1, and you can see very clearly what it does. You can just blend between where you move the vertices. After that, what you can do is link the object data of this mouth to the other ones as well. I should have done this before we duplicated them around everywhere, honestly, but it's too late now for that. So just link the object data of all the mouths to this one so they all have that shape key, and just play around with it until you get something that you like. And you want to also create a shape key that's open for the red mouth object that we have, so make sure to do that as well. After that, what you can do is you can click this copy as new driver button on the beak for the value of the shape key, then go to the red mouth and then hit paste driver there, and then what's going to happen is when you adjust the shape key on the beak, it's going to adjust the one on the mouth as well, so now it's opening and closing both of them at the same time. After you're done with that, what you have to do is, as you can see here, I'm selecting all of the mouth objects of our ducks, and I'm going to link the object data to the one that we had at the top so that they can all just get that shape key added to them. So what you want to do then after is separate their object data and just do the same exact thing that we did for the first one with these ones. So you want to basically separate all of these as their own so that they don't all open at the same time when we adjust the shape key, and we can adjust them individually. And after you're done with that, what you want to do is you want to copy the driver and then paste the driver to the mouths individually on all of the duck objects. Sorry if that's a bit confusing. I really should have done that when we were just working on a single duck before we duplicated it around everywhere, but I forgot to do that. So for part of the animation, I'm going to use the windy armature add-on. You can get it on my Gumroad page. What it lets you do is it lets you add technically wind to armatures, but it can be used for like a lot of other things. Like here, you can give like kind of like an idle animation to your ducks. So here I'm just using it to add some motion like that, and you can adjust the strength of it and the speed and all that as well, and the direction, so it's pretty cool. So as you can see, what I'm doing here is I'm just animating. Obviously you can rotate around your bones, have them going in like different directions, and then combined with the windy armature add-on applied to it, you'll be able to get a pretty good looking result very quickly, just like that. And obviously you'll have to play around with it a lot, but just animate your bones however you want. And yeah, what you see me doing now for this one duck, where I'm like opening the mouth and making it having like these random motions, is basically what I did just individually for the rest of all of the ducks as well. I made them have their own like unique motion so that it wasn't so boring. And yeah, what you see me doing now is basically the same thing I did for all of them. So I'm just going to show myself animating this one duck here because it's not a very unique process for the rest of them. If you want, you can see here what I'm doing is I'm adding some floating motion to our duck on the right hand side here by going into the Y location curve, and like we did with the camera, just adding a noise modifier to it. Also for our water object here, you'll notice it's not like moving, so we can animate the water displace empty that we made earlier, just going up and down. Remember to hit T and then linear on your timeline, then hit Shift D and linear extrapolation so that the animation goes on forever. And you can adjust the texture you made as well for the displace on that. As you can see here, it animates a lot better now. Over here, I added some wind to the leaves as well, and for the branches, just using my windy armature add-on and just adding in some wind just like that. And you can see this lets us animate things very easily. Same thing here for this top branches and flowers, I'm using my windy armature and I'm adding wind to them as well. Now to animate the ripples, it's very easy. If we just go to our wave texture, you'll see this phase offset feature, and you can just, with the wave texture node selected, hit I, and then you can insert a keyframe just like that and increase or decrease the value of it. Move forward in the timeline, then hit I again, and once again I always hit T linear on the timeline and then hit Shift T linear extrapolation so that the animation is just linear and continues forever. You'll also notice that this bucket we have down here, it's been kind of neglected because, I mean, it was off camera, so I didn't really put much effort into it, but basically if you want to add more detail to it, you can separate it as its own material, and you can also click the number button on the image textures here so that when you texture paint on the image textures here, it doesn't affect the bucket we have at the top, because remember originally this bottom bucket was just a duplicate of the top one, sharing the same material. But yeah, you can separate it like that, and if you want it to be more detailed, obviously you'd have to adjust those noise textures that we made as well with like the scratches on it and stuff, because it doesn't look good right now, but I don't really think it's necessary here because I don't plan on having this bottom thing in view. Lastly, what we can do is paste in this fog object, and if you download this file, you'll have them there. You can easily copy them in from my scene, and they're already pre-animated, so you can just paste them in and place them wherever you want if you want to use them. So yeah, you can have like a steam that way. It's a little sped up right now, but I'll slow it down for you guys. At this point, it's just like making micro adjustments until you get something that you like. So yeah, not really much to say there. I also recommend you add some kind of like petals flowing in the wind. So if you add a plane, put it to the right side, make it transparent by adding a transparent BSDF to it. And if you add a wind object, a wind force field, have it basically pointing in the direction of this plane and increase the strength, and then set this plane to be an emitter object. You can then model these petals and very quickly just have like something very simple. Give it like a simple material and hit M and then create a new collection for it. And then in the settings for the emitter, you can set the render as collection and just play around with the settings here, and you can basically get a nice flowing petal thing that comes. So just check out the settings that I'm adjusting here. Make sure the frame start, you should put it at like -50 so that it doesn't start at frame 1 and it's like already playing. Make sure you set the lifetime of the particles to be like at least 200, I'd say, or like however long works for you, I guess. But yeah, you can just play around with those settings and then get these falling petals. And then after this, obviously there's just like a bunch more micro adjustments you can make. I have to animate the rest of the ducks now, which I've already showed you how to do. So I'm going to do that and we'll be back soon. Alright guys, so in the end, this is what my file looked like. As you can see, pretty cool. Things are animating, and yeah, I hope you guys learned a lot, and if you really want to master this style, check out ukiyogirls.io. Ciao!